Imagine an empire so rich its gold could bankroll Europe for generations, and a single banking family so powerful they could build or break that empire overnight. In the 1700s, India wasn't merely a land of kings and palaces. It was the heart of a financial machine that even emperors bowed to. At the center of it all stood one name, whispered across courts and battlefields alike: Jagat Seths, banker of the world. They weren't just wealthy merchants. They were the shadow behind the throne, holding more silver, gold, and credit than the mighty British East India Company itself. Every war, every ruler, every rebellion in Bengal moved through their ledgers. And with a single stroke of their pen, they could decide who rose to power and who lost everything. But how did a handful of Indian bankers become the invisible hand behind both the fall of the Mughals and the rise of the British? This is the untold story of the men who financed empires, and without realizing it, handed India to Britain. In the early 1700s, under the last Mughal rulers, Bengal wasn't chaos. It was cash flow. Its fertile plains produced more revenue than the entire British Isles combined. But unlike Europe, where kings relied on taxes and conquests, India had something far more sophisticated: merchant bankers, private financiers, who could move money across continents faster than any royal treasury. And at the center of this network stood one dynasty, the Jagat Seths, literally bankers of the world. They weren't a single man, but a powerful Marwari family who transformed Bengal's booming trade into a private financial empire. They exchanged currencies, lent fortunes to princes, and even issued their own bills of credit centuries before central banks or the IMF existed. Picture them as a fusion of J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and a national treasury rolled into one. They financed armies, stabilized trade routes from Delhi to Dhaka, and even underwrote royal wars. When a Mughal prince needed to pay his soldiers or buy loyalty in court, he didn't go to the emperor. He went to the Seth vaults. But here's the danger of private money. Once it starts speaking louder than emperors, politics begins to obey finance. By the 1730s, the Mughal Empire had grown weak. Bengal's Nawabs ruled like kings in their own right, while the Jagat Seths had quietly become the real power behind the throne. They had financed the empire's rise and were about to fund its collapse. So how did a family of bookkeepers become kingmakers of an empire? The answer lies in one battle and one betrayal that changed the course of Indian history forever. By 1757, in the glittering capital of Murshidabad, a silent conspiracy was taking shape. The British East India Company, led by a young, ambitious soldier named Robert Clive, was no longer satisfied with trade. They wanted control, land taxes, and political power, but there was one problem. The company did not have the money or influence to topple Bengal's ruler, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The Jagat Seths, however, did. They had grown weary of Siraj's impulsive rule, his erratic spending, his disregard for the merchants who kept Bengal's wealth flowing. To the Seths, British rule looked not like an invasion, but an opportunity, a future built on order, profit, and partnership. And so in secret, they struck a deal with Clive. The Seths would quietly finance the company's army, paying soldiers, securing supplies, and greasing the right palms. In return, after victory, they would gain control over Bengal's treasury. What followed was not a war, but a transaction. The Battle of Plassey lasted barely a few hours. The British didn't win through might. They won through money and manipulation. The Nawab's generals already bribed with Seth. Gold stood still on the battlefield. Siraj's forces melted away. By nightfall, Siraj-ud-Dowlah was captured and executed. The British East India Company took command of Bengal, and the Jagat Seths, the very men who funded the coup, believed they had secured their influence for generations. but they had underestimated their new partners. The British had learned something far more valuable than gold money can conquer, faster than war. Within a few short years, the East India Company turned on the same financiers who had made their rise possible. Using Bengal's wealth as their war chest, they expanded their empire, while the Jagat Seths faded into the shadows. The very bankers who once financed the fall of the Mughals had just bankrolled their own downfall. So how much wealth did the British actually take? And what became of the Indian banking empire that once ruled Asia's trade? When Bengal fell, everything changed overnight. The East India Company didn't just seize territory. It seized the right to collect taxes known as the Diwani. In a single stroke, a trading corporation became the ruler of one of the richest regions on Earth. But there was one problem. The British didn't understand how India's intricate credit networks worked. They didn't have the trust, the reach, or the local intelligence. So they did what all empires do. They absorbed the system they couldn't replace. The Jagat Seths, once the independent masters of Indian finance, were now reduced to lenders under British supervision. In modern terms, this was the first hostile corporate takeover in Indian history. Before 1757, Bengal's wealth had stayed within India, circulating through its cities and villages, funding artisans, industries, and temples. After 1757, that same money began to flow in only one direction toward London. This was the beginning of what the economist Dadabhai Naoroji would later call the drain of wealth. Over the next 100 years, from 1757 to 1857, Britain extracted the equivalent of $45 trillion in today's value from India. It was wealth that built factories in Manchester, funded the Royal Navy, and fueled Britain's global dominance, all drawn from the revenues of Bengal. And as the British system expanded, India's private financiers, the Jagat Seths, the Marwaris, the Banaras, disappeared. The East India Company established a monopoly over credit and currency, dismantling the very network that had once sustained the Mughal economy. The Jagat Seth family itself fell from power. They faced political persecution, forced audits, and staged bankruptcies. By the 1770s, their fortune, once said to exceed that of the Bank of England, had vanished. The irony, the British had simply perfected the same financial system that once made India rich. But they turned it outward, channeling it into their own empire. The profits that once powered Bengal's prosperity now financed the Industrial Revolution. Could India's financial empire have survived if it had remained independent? The numbers say yes, but history had other plans. Here's what most textbooks don't tell you. Britain didn't fund its empire. India did. The taxes collected in Bengal after 1757 became the seed capital for Britain's wars in Europe, its expanding navy, and its global trading dominance. Every ship that left London's docks, every cannon forged for the Napoleonic Wars, every textile mill that powered the Industrial Revolution, all were in part financed by Indian money. Historical records even show that portions of Britain's Napoleonic campaigns were paid for with revenues siphoned from Bengal. Factories in Manchester and Liverpool ran on raw cotton from India, processed, and sold back to the very people who produced it. British exports to India surged, while India's own industries, once the envy of the world, collapsed. It was a self-feeding loop. Indian taxes paid for British soldiers. British soldiers protected British trade, and British trade ensured that even more Indian taxes could be collected. The cycle sustained itself for nearly a century. An elegant, brutal machine of empire financed by its colonies' own wealth. The Jagat Seths' legacy lived on, not in their name, but in the system they created. Their decentralized network of credit and trust became the very blueprint of colonial finance. The same structure that once built Bengal's prosperity now powered London's empire. And the greatest irony of all, Britain's celebrated financial revolution, its banking, its credit systems, its accounting methods was perfected in India long before it ever reached Europe. So what happens when the flow of money, the lifeblood of an empire, finally runs dry? When India's wealth stopped streaming into London's banks, the British Empire began to crack from within. By the mid-1800s, the East India Company, once the world's most powerful corporation, had collapsed under its own corruption and greed. The British Crown took direct control of India, but the financial engine that had fueled their rise was already slowing. Without India's endless trade surpluses, the British economy stagnated. The costs of empire, the wars, the railways, the administration began to exceed the profits. The same cycle that started when the Jagat Seths bankrolled one rebellion had come full circle. Once again, money not armies decided the fate of an empire. And by 1947, when Britain finally left India, the empire that once ruled half the world was buried under its own debts, more than 200% of its GDP. It was the same trap that had destroyed the Mughals 2 centuries earlier, spending power they no longer truly controlled. Empires fall when they forget who holds the money. For the Mughals, it was the Jagat Seths. For the British, it was the bond markets, and eventually the US dollar. So what's the lesson? History doesn't just repeat, it compounds. The saga of the Jagat Seths isn't merely about one family's fortune or fall. It's a mirror held up to every empire that believes military might can outlast financial reality. Because if history has proven anything, it's that no empire, no matter how powerful, survives when the money runs out. If this video gave you some value, then don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share with anyone who like that type of content.